The issue isn't just whether China keeps its word. The real issue is what happens when they don't. From trade and tariffs to cyber deals to crushed treaties in Hong Kong to sabotage in scientific cooperation. If this were just a series of isolated incidents, we might chalk it up to miscommunication, a policy shift, a diplomatic stumble, but it's not. It's a pattern. Welcome to Global Risk Profile, where we break down the headlines that matter and the ones that should. Today, we're asking a simple question with profound consequences. Can the Chinese Communist Party be trusted to keep a deal? Because if history is any guide, the answer isn't just no, it's absolutely not for long. Let's go back to 2001, a pivotal year for China and the global economy. That's when the Chinese Communist Party achieved what many in the West saw as a sign of hope: full membership in the World Trade Organization. The promise at the time was sweeping. In exchange for market access and global legitimacy, China would liberalize its economy. It would stop propping up bloated state-owned giants with government subsidies. It would end price distortions, reduce tariffs, and play by the same rules as everyone else. But what happened? Behind the glowing headlines, the CCP kept its grip tight on the levers of economic power. State-owned enterprises continued to benefit from massive subsidies. Market pricing remained an illusion in key sectors like steel and energy, and foreign firms found themselves stuck in a maze of red tape, local favoritism, and forced technology transfers. Then came the rare earths case, an early test of whether China would respect the rules it signed up for. Between 2010 and 2012, China began restricting exports of rare earth minerals, which are crucial to high-tech manufacturing and military applications. The move sent shockwaves through supply chains across the West. The US, the EU, and Japan took China to the WTO and won. The ruling was clear. These export controls violated China's commitments. And here's the pattern. China eventually rolled back the restrictions, but only after years of legal wrangling, only after the pressure built, only when compliance was less costly than continued resistance. Fast forward to 2020, the Trump administration's Phase 1 deal with China. Another big promise. China agreed to purchase an additional $200 billion worth of US goods and services over 2 years. It was billed as a win for American farmers, manufacturers, and energy producers, but the results? Disappointing and predictable. By the end of 2021, China had failed to meet even 60% of those purchase targets. And there were no meaningful consequences, no snapback tariffs, no formal dispute resolution, just more spin and more delay. And don't forget the 2015 Cybersecurity Agreement. This one wasn't about soybeans or semiconductors. It was about national security. President Obama and Xi Jinping stood side by side and pledged that neither country would conduct or support cyber-enabled theft of intellectual property. For a brief moment, Chinese cyber attacks on American companies appeared to slow. But by 2018, it was clear the pause was temporary. US authorities began exposing a wave of cyber operations linked to Chinese intelligence services, targeting everything from university research to defense contractors. Once again, an agreement signed under scrutiny, quietly discarded once the spotlight faded. So, when we talk about the deals with the CCP, let's be honest, we're not dealing with misunderstandings or execution failures. We're dealing with a pattern. And in this case, that pattern began the moment China entered the global system. Now, if this were just a US-China issue, we might chalk it up to bilateral friction, two superpowers jockeying for a position. But the truth is, this isn't personal, it's structural. Let's talk about Europe. After nearly 8 years of painstaking negotiations, the EU and China announced the Comprehensive Agreement on Investment, or CAI, in December of 2020. The idea was simple on paper. European companies would gain better access to China's notoriously closed markets. In return, China would gain legitimacy and a seat at the grown-up table, especially after 4 years of trade turbulence with the United States. The deal had momentum. Chancellor Merkel pushed for it. Macron endorsed it. Brussels framed it as a breakthrough. And then, in classic fashion, Beijing overplayed its hand. When the EU imposed limited sanctions on Chinese officials over the mass internment of Uyghurs in Xinjiang, the CCP retaliated not with a rebuttal, but with a blacklist. It sanctioned sitting members of the European Parliament. It targeted European think tanks, diplomats, and human rights scholars. The move was so aggressive, so openly punitive, that the European Parliament halted ratification of the CII altogether. Just like that, nearly a decade of diplomacy was trashed, not because of a policy disagreement, but because Beijing doesn't tolerate criticism. Next came the clash over electric vehicles. In 2024, the EU imposed provisional tariffs on Chinese EV imports, arguing that Chinese state subsidies has created an unfair playing field. This wasn't paranoia, it was backed by data. Chinese EVs were being dumped at prices European manufacturers couldn't match. China responded the way it often does, not by engaging the policy issue, but by retaliating economically. Beijing slapped tariffs on European brandy, pork, and medical devices. It began quietly signaling to its state-backed companies to steer clear of European procurement tenders. Again, agreement signed, cooperation promised, pressure applied, and the deal broken at the moment the EU asserted its own interests. And it's not just Europe. The story plays out with eerie similarity in Southeast Asia too, except there, the imbalance is more economic than legal. In 2010, China signed on to the ASEAN-China Free Trade Agreement, promising reciprocal benefits, balanced trade, and investment in the region's development. But over the next decade, something else happened. China's state-driven industrial machine flooded Southeast Asian markets with steel, solar panels, cement, and consumer electronics. Local industries couldn't compete. In 2013, ASEAN had a $10.4 billion trade deficit with China, but by 2023 the deficit has ballooned to over $140 billion, and that's before factoring in China's increasingly opaque export practices and backdoor subsidies. Even worse, in recent years, Chinese exporters have begun using Southeast Asia as a smokescreen, rerouting shipments through ports in Vietnam, Thailand, and Malaysia to avoid US tariffs. These transshipments are technically legal until proven otherwise, but they completely undermine the spirit of US and global trade enforcement. And it's not just trade, it's infrastructure. In Vietnam, for example, the high-profile Thai Nguyen steel complex built with Chinese partners collapsed financially. The Chinese investor quietly withdrew. The project stalled, debt piled up. What started as a promise of a win-win development turned into a one-sided burden for the host country. So, when we zoom out, the picture sharpens. Europe signs deals and gets punished for standing on principle. Asia signs deals and gets buried under trade deficits and dependencies. The tactics differ slightly depending on the target, but the pattern, it's the same. So far, we've been talking about trade deals, markets, tariffs, export controls, but the CCP's pattern of signing agreements and then breaking them, it doesn't stop at economics. In fact, it gets even more brazen and more dangerous when we move into the realm of security, sovereignty, human rights, and science. Let's start with India, China's neighbor and geopolitical rival. Back in 1993, China and India signed what seemed like a sensible and stabilizing agreement, the Border Peace and Tranquility Agreement. The goal was to de-escalate tensions along the long-disputed Himalayan border, especially in high-risk flashpoints like Ladakh and Arunachal Pradesh. Over the next 2 decades, the two countries signed 4 additional agreements, reinforcing mutual commitments to avoid conflict. No aggressive posturing, no live firearms, routine communication between military commands. And yet, in June of 2020, Chinese forces crossed the line of actual control in the Galwan Valley. What followed was a deadly hand-to-hand clash, the worst border violence between the two countries in over 50 years. Indian soldiers were killed. China, as usual, downplayed and obscured the incident. But the message was clear. When Beijing decides the rules no longer suit its interest, it simply stops following them. Then there is Hong Kong, perhaps the most high-profile case of broken international promises in recent memory. In 1984, under the Sino-British Joint Declaration, China agreed to preserve Hong Kong's political and economic freedoms under the formula of one country, two systems for 50 years. That agreement was legally binding and lodged with the United Nations. But just 23 years in, Beijing ripped it apart. First came the political disqualifications. Opposition lawmakers were removed. Then came the arrests, journalists, protest leaders, activists. Finally, in 2020 came the National Security Law, a sweeping extraterritorial law passed unilaterally by Beijing that effectively criminalized dissent, shut down civil society, and erased the line between Hong Kong and the mainland. By every objective measure, the CCP broke its treaty with the UK and the world. And when called out, Chinese officials insisted the agreement was a historical document with no practical significance. Think about that. A regime that signs a treaty, then later declares it is irrelevant because too much time has passed. Now let's turn to academic and cultural fronts, where the CCP has pursued influence under the banner of exchange and cooperation. For years, Confucius Institutes were sold to foreign universities as language and culture centers, but inside of these programs, a different agenda operated. Sensitive topics were censored, instructors were vetted by Beijing, and campuses were pressured to avoid criticism of the Chinese government. In one particularly revealing incident, the head of the Confucius Institute headquarters ordered conference materials to be physically torn out of delegates' folders at a European Sinology conference because they mentioned institutions from Taiwan. That's not a cultural misunderstanding. That's ideological policing on foreign soil. And then there is scientific research. Since 1979, the US and China had cooperated under a science and technology agreement, covering everything from agriculture to physics. But in 2023, after growing mistrust and multiple red flags, that agreement was allowed to lapse for the first time in over 40 years. Why? Because China refused to share key biological samples, because it barred foreign researchers from accessing data in Chinese labs, because its new data security law made it nearly impossible for international teams to do collaborative work without running afoul of vague and sweeping national security restrictions. Let's not forget, during the early stages of the COVID-19 outbreak, Chinese officials withheld virus sequences, punished whistleblowers, and delayed international access to Ground Zero in Wuhan. This wasn't just a failure of transparency. It was a violation of China's own agreements, and it likely cost the world precious weeks in responding to a global pandemic. So when we say the CCP breaks deals, we don't mean just on soybeans or steel. We're talking about treaties, joint declarations, research pacts, cultural exchanges, the entire architecture of global cooperation. And when the stakes are this high, when it's border security, press freedom, or pandemic intelligence, the cost of trusting Beijing isn't just economic. It's human, it's strategic, and it's global. So let's pause for a moment, because we've now covered a lot of ground, from trade and tariffs to cyber deals to crushed treaties in Hong Kong to sabotage in scientific cooperation. If this were just a series of isolated incidents, we might chalk it up to miscommunication, a policy shift, a diplomatic stumble, but it's not. It's a pattern. And it goes like this. The Chinese Communist Party agrees to deals when it feels vulnerable, when it's under pressure. That pressure might come from a financial crisis like the late 1990s when it sought WTO accession, or from diplomatic isolation like after the 1989 Tiananmen Square massacre, or from military or economic pushback like during the height of the US-China trade war. In those moments, when the spotlight is hot and the leverage is low, Beijing plays the part of a reasonable actor. It signs agreements, it hosts summits, it promises reforms, it invokes multiculturalism. But the moment the pressure lifts, the moment the CCP judges that it once again holds the upper hand, it begins to quietly retreat from those commitments. It delays, it obscures, it rewrites definitions, it reinterprets one country, two systems, it calls treaties historic documents, it tightens the screws under the radar until the deal is dead. Not in writing, but in practice. And if the party dares to protest, China retaliates. It imposes tariffs. It bans products. It punishes scholars. It floods your markets. Or it simply turns off access and walks away. It's a cycle, one we've seen repeat over and over and over again for more than 30 years. In 2001, the WTO deal signed. Then China grows stronger and compliance withers. In 2015, the cyber deal signed. A brief pause and then full resumption of state-backed hacking. In 2020, Phase 1 deal signed. Purchase target missed, no consequences. In 2021, the CAI agreement reached with Europe. Then the EU criticizes human rights and the deal is torpedoed by Beijing. In 2023, the US-China Science Pact up for renewal. China blocks data access and the pact collapses. In each case, the arc is the same. Crisis leads to cooperation. Cooperation leads to consolidation. Consolidation leads to breach. And the West, too often we act surprised, as if this time might be different, as if the handshake meant more than history. But we're not dealing with a partner who sees treaties as binding contracts. We're dealing with a regime that views them as instruments of strategy, to be honored when useful and abandoned when not. Now, this is the moment where we have to confront something deeper. Because once you recognize the pattern, once you see that the CCP consistently signs agreements only to break them when it suits their interests, you're left with a bigger, more uncomfortable question. What kind of regime are we actually dealing with? This isn't just a story of failed trade compliance or academic censorship. It's about the nature of power and the way it's wielded by the Chinese Communist Party. And oddly enough, if you study other strategic actors, especially in the realm of conflict or ideology, you notice something familiar. There is a term used in asymmetric warfare, hudna. It comes from early Islamic history, but in modern usage it's often invoked when militant or terror groups declare a temporary truce, not as a step toward peace, but as a pause to regroup, rearm, and reposition. The ceasefire isn't sincere, it's tactical. Sounds familiar? Because that's exactly how the CCP treats international agreements. Not as the foundation for mutual trust, but as a breathing space, a moment to relieve pressure, to avoid sanctions, and to buy time while consolidating strength. When a terrorist organization declares a hudna, we don't take it at face value. At least now we don't. We understand what it is, a pause in a broader conflict, a strategic lull before the next move. But with the CCP, we shake hands with signed deals and then act surprised when the commitments vanish the moment the leverage shifts. Let's take a step back and clarify something. Morality has never been the explicit foundation of international relations. The world has always run on power, interest, and leverage, shaped by geography, economics, and security needs. But even in that realist system, morality wasn't absent. It was embedded quietly in the norms that govern behavior. There was an expectation that treaties would be honored, that reputations mattered, that deception carried a cost. Not because everyone was noble, but because even cynical actors knew that trust, once broken, couldn't easily be restored, and that certain red lines, like invading your neighbor or violating your own promises, would trigger consequences. That's what made a system relatively stable, not perfect, but functional. What we're seeing with the CCP is something qualitatively different. This isn't just power politics. This is a regime that violates the norms without paying the cost. That treats every agreement as tactical, not temporary if needed, but temporary by default. So we are forced to ask, who wants to make a deal or become an ally with someone for whom betrayal is only a matter of timing? Because at that point, the deal itself becomes a liability. It lures you into dependence. It makes you predictable. And then when you least expect it, it becomes the very tool used against you. This is more than a critique of the CCP. It's a warning to the rest of us, especially those in Washington, Brussels, and beyond, who continue to sign, shake hands, and smile as though this time might be different. Because when we normalize this behavior, When we reward it, we're not just empowering a dangerous regime. We are rewriting the rules of the global system. We're training the world to believe that promises are just placeholders until something better comes along. So again, we ask, what kind of regime are we dealing with? And what kind of world are we helping build by refusing to confront it? So, here we are again. A new agreement, a fresh handshake, a joint statement from Washington and Beijing declaring a breakthrough in trade relations. This time, it was the Geneva Accord signed just a while ago, framed as a de-escalation, a partial rollback of tariffs, a return perhaps to stability, and already signs of friction are emerging. American officials are raising concerns that China may be falling short on early implementation, particularly on critical exports like rare earths, key minerals, and access to regulated sectors. Chinese state media denies everything, calling concerns fabricated. Chinese diplomats blame Washington for stirring tension. We've seen this script before. The question is, what will happen next? Will the agreement quietly erode as so many before it have? Or has the US government this time built in the tools to monitor, verify, and respond before the damage is done? Maybe the current administration believes this deal will hold. Maybe it's a calculated risk. Maybe it's a chance for China to prove it can act differently. Some might argue that this time is different, not because China has changed, but because American leadership has. That under a second Trump term, the US is finally playing hardball. The Trump, having learned from phase one and from the chaotic global supply chain crisis, now understands the CCP better than anyone before and won't be fooled twice. That's a serious claim, and it's worth taking seriously. But we should also remember, the CCP doesn't need you to be naive. It just needs you to be overconfident. Even Trump, who prides himself on making deals and spotting weakness, seems to be experiencing this firsthand. Consider how he's described his recent efforts to end the war in Ukraine. By most accounts, his team has bent over backward to make a peace deal possible, pressuring Zelensky to make concessions, seemingly to remove any excuse for Putin to refuse. And yet, according to Trump himself, despite all the smiles and pleasant calls, Putin continues to bomb Ukrainian cities and kill civilians. It's been 6 months since Trump returned to office, and the war goes on. That's a sobering parallel, because if Putin's very nice talk masks ongoing brutality, what might the CCP's polite diplomacy be hiding? And here's the difference. In Ukraine, the victims are Ukrainian and Russian. But if the CCP breaks its word in this New Deal, the fallout lands here on American industries, workers, and families. This isn't just a matter of foreign policy. It's about America's own resilience when the breach inevitably comes. Because even when US leaders negotiate from strength, even when we impose tariffs, deny technology, or push allies to decouple, the CCP still finds ways to exploit gray zones, to delay, to hide, to retaliate indirectly. It doesn't need to rip the deal up in public. It just needs to slow roll compliance until the political calendar shifts or until a crisis changes the headlines. So yes, leadership does matter. Leverage matters. Resolve matters. But history reminds us, none of that matters without enforcement, transparency, and fallback capacity. The question isn't whether the next president can make China comply. It's whether we've built a system that doesn't require blind faith in anyone's strength or anyone's good intentions. And here is the key point. The issue isn't just whether China keeps its word. The real issue is what happens to the US and to the economy, security, and supply chains when they don't. Because the next time China violates this deal and shuts down exports of rare earths, or chokes the global supply of magnets, or raises barriers to critical components for aerospace or defense industries, we can't be scrambling to find alternatives. By then, it's already too late. That's what makes this different from a broken treaty on paper. This isn't about bruised egos or diplomatic snubs. This is about real-world vulnerability, the kind that affects everything from electric vehicles to missile guidance systems to medical equipment. So let's not ask, will the deal be broken? Let's ask, where will we source our essential materials when it is? What domestic capacity we have rebuilt in the meantime? What fallback networks have we created with allies? And how fast can we shift without panic when the leverage flips? These are the questions that matter, and how or whether we answer them will determine whether this is just another cycle of naive optimism or the start of a new kind of realism. So, if we take all of this seriously, if we acknowledge the pattern, if we recognize the nature of the regime we're dealing with, and if we admit that the latest trade deal will almost certainly be broken, not because of misunderstanding, but because that's how the CCP operates, then the question becomes, what can the United States and its allies do now, while there is still time to act? This isn't about posturing. It's not about scoring political points. It's about building resilience into the systems, economic, technological, and strategic. And it starts with something very simple, but often overlooked. 1. Assume the deal will be broken. Plan accordingly. This is the baseline. Agreements with the CCP should no longer be treated as guarantees, but as time-limited windows. That means we don't build dependence into the arrangement. We use the time the deal buys us to diversify, to reshore, to friendshore the vulnerable parts of our supply chain, especially in rare earths, magnets, semiconductors, and critical pharmaceutical ingredients. 2. Create automatic enforcement triggers. Don't wait for lengthy diplomatic cycles. Build in real measurable benchmarks and set consequences that activate automatically when they're missed. Time is leverage. Delay benefits the violator. 3. Invest in visibility. Public, real-time transparency tools. Dashboards that track export flows, trade data, and fulfillment of commitments. Let the facts speak louder than the spin, and let allies, businesses, and the public see it in real time. 4. Strengthen alliances, but with clarity. Coordinate not just defense, but economic fallback strategies with countries like Japan, South Korea, India, Australia, and key partners in Europe and Latin America. Shared vulnerability leads to hesitation. Shared contingency plans lead to strength. 5. Rebuild domestic capacity where it matters most. We don't need to reshore everything, but in key sectors, rare earths processing, precision manufacturing, strategic pharmaceuticals, AI chips, etc., we need redundancy, reliability, and the ability to ramp up without panic. That's not nationalism, that's national security. And finally, 6, reframe our expectations. This isn't about whether the Chinese Communist Party will change. It won't. It's about whether we can stop pretending they already have. We can still trade, we can still talk, but we can no longer afford to build our strategy on wishful thinking. Because the price of being wrong, again, is no longer just economic. It's geopolitical, it's structural, it's existential. At Global Risk Profile, we try to do one simple thing. See the world as it is, not as we wish it were. That doesn't mean giving up on ideals. It means grounding them in reality. Because when you understand the patterns, the motives, and the histories, you can begin to prepare and you can begin to lead. The Chinese Communist Party has a pattern. It makes deals when it's weak. It breaks them when it's strong. It uses diplomacy not to build trust, but to buy time. And yet, we still keep entering into these deals as if they were built to last. Maybe because hope dies hard. Maybe it's because we still confuse engagement with transformation. Or maybe, just maybe, it's because we've grown afraid of what it would mean to finally stop pretending. But clarity isn't cynicism, it's responsibility. Because if we know the pattern, if we know the history, if we understand what kind of regime we're dealing with, then we have no excuse to be caught off guard. This latest trade deal isn't the beginning of a new chapter. It's the opening scene of a test, one that will reveal whether we've learned from the last 30 years or whether we're still stuck playing a game we don't understand. Thanks for listening. Please subscribe, share, and join us next time, where the headlines meet history and the future comes into focus.